Hello and welcome to yet another Podcast Pontifications with me, Evo Terra. If you're watching this on video, please know you are not getting the podcast. This is a video that's about podcasting. If you want the podcast, it's available, and 108 other episodes are available at podcastpontifications.com. This is not going to be a talk about SEO, but it is going to be a conversation about how to stop Google from ignoring your podcast. New news out from Marco, our friend who runs Overcast, very popular podcatching platform as it was, Overcast, and Marco's just released something new called Instant Search to his app, podcast listening app. And that's cool, but to me the revelation was when he said that over 80% of searches, all 80% of the time someone chooses to listen to a podcast inside of Overcast. Now remember, this is an app that is exclusively podcasting only. That's all that's in here. It's a directory. It's an app listening device directory all in one. And 80% of the time when someone chooses to listen to a podcast, it's because they searched for that podcast by name. Now, we said a few of them are more generic terms, but the vast majority of searches are by name, which means somebody is going and looking for the exact thing they're looking for close to 80% of the time. 80% of the users for this app know what they're looking for already. So how do they figure out what they're looking for? And what does that actually mean? That's funny, because I spent a lot of time in the Google world back when Google was still in a garage. That's when I started working with Google, on Google, and never for Google. And one of the things that we knew right away was that most people, when they're searching Google, most people don't go to Google because they know what company they're looking for. They go to their browser bar and they just type in mcdonalds.com or whatever. When people use a real search engine like Google, then they're actually searching for concepts, business, places to take my kid this weekend, events tonight, those sorts of things. And when they do search for a brand, we call those navigational searches, and they're a very small piece of the Google pie, but they're important. That's what people buy their own brand name, so that if you are, somebody does search for your brand name because they didn't think to put in the .com, it can show up. Great. All right, I'm getting way too deep into the weeds on search. So we know that most discovery isn't happening inside of these apps like Overcast. If 80% of the time somebody is searching for the name of a podcast they already know, how do they know it? Well, one of the most popular ways you get to know stuff is from our friends at Google, from search engines. You're searching around for content, especially if it's content that somebody wants they don't know about already. Hey, I'm looking for a podcast about XYZ. Well, that doesn't seem to happen all that much inside of the apps, but it happens quite a lot on Google. So this is a conversation about how to stop Google from ignoring your podcast, because let's say you're a financial advisor, apropos of everything, and you've got a podcast for other financial advisors, and you want other financial advisors to find it. You need to be found on the Googs, as we call them. But unfortunately, as Google is kind of ignoring your content, and that's an unfortunate thing. So what most people turn to when they're in this situation, whether they're financial advisors or not, a podcast owner says, hey, I want my podcast content to be discovered on Google. Quick, let's apply some SEO to that content. Yeah, well, good luck. There are certainly things you should be doing right, writing good titles and descriptions, which I've talked about ad nauseum on this show. But really, if you want for Google to stop ignoring your content, and by that, I mean, you want the opposite of that. You want Google to rank your content highly. And again, this is not going to be a talk about how to SEO. But if you want that kind of stuff, you have to take a different approach. Take it from me, a guy who has been doing SEO work, off and on, mostly hating it, but pretty good at it, since 1997. I'm telling you, asking someone to SEO existing content is a bad idea. If you want to get Google to really recognize your content and not ignore your content, you got to start there. You got to think about fresh content. Yeah, you got to do all the things like good titles and descriptions and have link architecture and yada, 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 yada. But if you really want Google to stop ignoring your podcast, you've got to start creating content on your podcast that Google tells you you should. And I know that sounds crazy. I know that sounds nuts. Why would you make content that Google likes? Who cares? Well, that's where the searches are happening. That Google only likes what people like. Google only likes what people are searching for, and that's what they're really telling you to do. But if you try and take an approach of, I want Google to recognize my existing content, you will have less success at that as opposed to creating content from the start, that Google tells you people are looking for. So maybe it's time to pause operations for a moment, business podcaster, and rethink things. Maybe it's time to go through and do the painful things like, keyword research, and figuring out what relevancy and where you rank and domain authorities and page authorities and all those terrible things that confuse you. Okay, I get it. But if you really want to stop Google from ignoring your podcast, just installing the Yoast SEO plugin on your WordPress site that hosts your blog or that runs your podcast, that's not going to do it. You're just trying to apply, that's rearranging deck chairs. Right? That's dressing up a pig. Whatever other analogy you want to use to that. If you really want to make content that Google recognizes, you got to figure out what content Google wants you to produce or what content Google is suggesting you produce. Again, if you've got a financial advisory podcast and Google tells you to, you should be producing shows on poultry production, clearly you've done bad keyword research. It's not a good idea. And this is not an episode to talk about how to do keyword research, because that's a long conversation. This is an episode where I'm telling you to rethink your assumptions. Google traffic is important because it tells you what people are looking for, and that's the kind of content you should be creating for your business if there's a business goal in mind. Now, if you've got this far as you're a hobbyist, chances are you've already bailed because you don't care. And a lot of podcasters don't care what search traffic they could be getting from their podcast. That's fine. Most people don't care about that, and they want to produce the things that they're passionate about, that they love, and they want to produce. And businesses want to produce content they want to get out in the world. That's all fine. But the minute you come to me or any other consultant and say, we need to apply some good SEO practices to our existing content, we're going to have questions for you. We're going to be asking you, why are we focusing on existing content when we should be looking towards new content? Because if we want Google to pay attention to us, we've got to pay attention to Google. And that's a very different mindset than just tweak and copy, because that doesn't work anymore. I know it's a high-level, weird topic to talk about, and I didn't go into great details, but this is about making you think about things differently, more than telling you exactly what to do. So again, if you want content that Google cares about, you got to figure out what that content should be first, and then create that kind of content. Do it 10 episodes in a row. Figure out what 10 episodes should be. That content you should create based on what Google is telling you people are looking for. Then, if you do that after 10 episodes, maybe, if you've got other things done properly, it might work. At least you're putting out the content you know people are looking for. It's one of the things we struggle with. What should I talk about? Well, ask Google. Google knows what people are searching for. And if you do it, again, Google will eventually stop ignoring your podcast and reward you for your efforts, assuming you do it all properly. And again, lots more depth to go into, but if you're a business and this matters to you, then it matters to you. Then you should do that. Now, if you want help with all this, again, I got 20 years of doing all that terrible SEO work, which I try not to do anymore, but I do apply good practices like this to all of my clients moving forward. So if you have some questions and you want to do things better for your business podcast, get in touch, because this is what I do. I launch podcasts and keep my clients out of the technical weeds. Get in touch. evo@podcastlaunch.pro. Podcastlaunch.pro shows a list of services I offer for my clients, and I shall be back tomorrow with yet another podcast pontifications. Cheers.